Re-
Okay, today we are going to get back to some authoritarian states and talk about the emergence of Fidel Castro's Cuba. Now, to begin the discussion of the rise of Fidel Castro, we've got to talk about some of the problems that existed in Cuba in the 1950s, starting with their economic weakness. Cuba was one of the wealthiest nations in Latin America by the mid-20th century, but the state's economy was not diversified. The vast majority of Cuba's wealth came from their sugar crop. This was a very monocultured state. 3/5 of the Cuban workforce was working on sugar plantations, and sugar amounted for 1/4 of their exports. Now, the United States was Cuba's most important trading partner, with the United States paying inflated rates for Cuban sugar that offered then American goods, manufactured products to Cuban markets. But if anything were to ever disrupt this relationship, like a repressive Cuban regime under Fulgencio Batista, that could dramatically affect Cuba's economy. American investors also supported and controlled much of the Cuban gas and electricity and rail and banking systems in Cuba. So there was a deep connection between the United States and the Cuban economy. There was also a vast disparity in wealth between the few wealthy Cuban elites and the masses of impoverished Cubans across the country. There was also political weakness in Cuba. Now, going back to 1903, following Cuban independence after the Spanish-American War, the United States wrote into the Cuban Constitution, essentially, what was known as the Platt Amendment, that gave the United States favorable political terms over Cuba. It offered the United States the ability to militarily intervene in Cuba if we ever saw conditions in Cuba unfavorable to our liking. Cuba could not enter into any third-party agreements without the approval of the United States, and the United States would receive a permanent lease on the base at Guantanamo Bay, where we would establish a naval base in eastern Cuba. So Cuba's economic dependence on the United States made it impossible for them to ever gain real, full political independence. We add to this environment the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista. Now, he was a general in the military that was actually president of Cuba in the 1940s. But following the rise of democracy in Cuba, Fulgencio Batista, in March of 1952, would launch a coup against a democratically elected president in Cuba, and he followed that by a suspension of the Cuban Constitution. Now, his rule for a time was supported by the wealthy elite in Cuba and their business allies in the United States. He opened up Cuba to corrupt dealings and interactions with the United States mafia that turned Cuba and its capital of Havana into a resort destination for many wealthy Americans. Over the 1950s, that gulf between the wealthy and the impoverished in Cuba continued to widen. Opposition to Batista grew following his seizure of power in 1952. He faced opposition from student groups who advocated for more political rights. He faced opposition from rural agricultural workers who were struggling economically. He faced opposition from a communist party like many Latin American countries, was starting to grow in opposition to the economic conditions that regular folks in these Latin American countries faced. Over time, also, Batista would lose support of the United States government as his corruption and his political repressions grew more harsh. Now we turn to Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro was an educated lawyer in Cuba who had advocated and worked for the poorer workers in that country. In the late 1940s, Castro would take part in revolutionary movements outside of Cuba in the Dominican Republic and in Colombia. But back in Cuba, he hoped to be able to rise through the political ranks and challenge what he saw as a corrupt government. He was a member of the Partido Ortodoxo in Cuba. This was a left-wing political party that supported a platform of anti-corruption, along with nationalization of foreign businesses in Cuba to bring more of that wealth or keep more of that wealth within the nation. The 1952 coup of Fulgencio Batista ended any hope that Fidel Castro might rise through legitimate political ranks in Cuba, and it pushed him towards a more revolutionary movement. That revolutionary movement began on July 26 of 1953 with the MONCADO barracks attack. Castro, with a small group of followers, launched an attack on the MONCADO military barracks in Cuba in a hope to overthrow the Batista dictatorship. But his small force of lightly armed fighters was no match for over 1,000 soldiers of the Cuban military, and it was an absolute failure. Castro would be arrested and put on trial. A trial where Castro gives a long, almost 4-hour speech that is known as the "History Will Absolve Me" speech. It later becomes a propaganda victory for Castro, as his speech will become a part of his future political movement. He called in that speech for a restoration of the Constitution, land reform. Remember that land reform is taking land from the wealthy landowners or corporations and distributing it amongst the people. He called for education reform in Cuba. He called for an end of corruption in Cuba. For his efforts in the MONCADO barracks attack, Castro would receive a prison sentence of 15 years, but that ended up only lasting 2. The effects of this assault give birth to what is known as the 26th July movement in Cuba. This is Castro's political and military movement to ultimately take over the island of Cuba. Batista's harsh treatment of many of the rebels following this movement would bring some negative light to the state, and also cause some questions from the United States about the ability of Batista to maintain control of that government. And it increased Castro's stature amongst the common people. In 1954, in an attempt to appear more democratic, Batista held elections, but these weren't fair elections. There was no real opposition, as Fidel Castro himself was still in prison. In 1955, in a hope that it would gain him some popular favor, many political prisoners in Cuba were freed, including Fidel Castro. Castro himself went to Mexico, where he could organize his 26th of July movement for his next step. It was in Mexico that Fidel Castro met Che Guevara, who would ultimately shape a lot of Castro's ideals. Anti-Batista movements would continue to grow within Cuba, and Batista canceled future elections. Now, in Mexico, Fidel Castro was greatly impacted by the ideology of Che Guevara. Che Guevara was an Argentinian who had taken part in many revolutionary movements in Latin America. He was anti-capitalist, he was anti-American, and he was hoping to bring this revolution to Cuba, and Castro could help him do that. Guevara's ideology was shaped greatly by the overthrow of the democratically elected President Arbenz in Guatemala in 1954. Remember, that revolution, or that coup, was supported by the United States CIA. Guevara believed that he and Castro needed to avoid any direct conflict with the Cuban military. They were outmanned, they were outgunned, but that a war should come through guerrilla warfare. And they should gain the support of the common people of Cuba, who could offer assistance to the guerrillas. Guevara also believed that the United States was an enemy of the common people, and they always backed repressive governments in Latin America. The 26th July movement would return to Cuba in what is known as the GRANMA attack, where over 80 fighters that were a part of this 26th July movement sailed from Mexico to southern Cuba in an attempt to take the city of Santiago and launch a wider revolution from there. This, like the earlier 26th July attack on the MONCADO barracks, was an absolute failure. Most of the attackers were killed or captured, but Fidel Castro and his brother Raul and Che Guevara were able to escape to the Sierra Maestra Mountains, where they continued to organize and grow their movement. This movement grew as the peasants in the region saw Fidel Castro and his movement as more supportive than the actual Cuban government. And Castro, to his part, promised reforms for the people once their movement was victorious. Fidel Castro would use radio to spread propaganda messages to the Cuban peasants, with Castro himself giving many speeches to the people. He also gave interviews to the foreign press, and he presented himself as a freedom fighter working for the poor against Battista's repressive regime. Now, as the Battista government was dealing with more attacks, both from Castro's forces and from other rebel movements in Cuba, his repression of the people grew. So much so that in 1957, the United States pulled support from Battista and eventually put a full embargo on the Cuban government, no longer shipping oil or military weapons to the Cuban government. This bolstered Castro's forces against the Battista regime. And following the autumn offensive in 1958 and further victories of the rebel forces in this guerrilla warfare, Fulgencio Batista fled Cuba in December of 1958. And by January of 1959, Fidel Castro, seen above me here, his brother Che Guevara, and the July 26 movement entered Havana, Cuba victorious and took control of the government. We'll see you next time.